Hey guys, today on JD Cars, we'll be installing a completely bolt-on rough country 4-inch long arm lift kit on my Jeep Wrangler Unlimited Sport. So today I'll begin to tackle the process of lifting the Jeep here and installing this rough country long arm lift kit. A lot of you have actually asked about the lift on this vehicle as well as the wheels and tires. And it's actually all stock, believe it or not. It's on stock suspension, stock size tires, but it does appear to be lifted, and the front axle even appears to be a bit wider because of these EAG stubby fender flares. So if you think it looks lifted now, just wait until it's lifted another 4 inches. So let's head into the garage and I'll show you what I got. So I may have told you in a previous Jeep video that I had some surprises for the Jeep. And I certainly do. I have over 15 packages here from Rough Country, the majority of them being for the lift kit, but I do have a couple other exciting surprises for the Jeep here. Now, before you get working on the Jeep, I do want to pull all of the components out of the lift kit, get them laid out, and just familiarize ourselves with all the components, as well as give you a rundown of everything that's included. So just to spare you some time, I'm gonna get everything unboxed and laid out, opposed to individually unboxing each one of these boxes. So I'll get everything laid out and show you exactly what's included in this kit. So your Rough Country 4-inch long arm lift kit will be split up into 10 boxes here if you opt for the Vertex shocks like I did. I believe we have our control arms in these boxes here, some other brackets and whatnot in these boxes. So I'm just gonna jump into it, tear them open, and we'll get a look at it. I am really excited to see these Vertex shocks. From what I saw online, they look sweet. All right, got it all unboxed here and laid out. And here's our Rough Country 4-inch long arm lift kit. So we have all of our control arms, our dual rate coil springs, which are really cool. They have 2 spring rates, which gives you the best of both worlds. Front track bar, an exhaust pipe for those of you who do have to modify your exhaust. I'm not sure that I do. We have our new control arm brackets, which are gonna bolt onto the frame. Some additional brackets and hardware. We have our rear sway bar link kit and our front sway bar quick disconnect kit, along with a whole bunch of other hardware here. And then finally, probably my favorite part of this kit, these insane Vertex shocks. The camera does these shocks no justice whatsoever, and when I saw them in the pictures, I really didn't think they were that insane, but in person, you'll realize these are some huge shocks. Look just next to my hand here. These are some insanely large shocks. They have a 2.5-inch diameter. They're absolutely massive, and the adjustment knob on them has a really nice feel. And if you listen here, clicks into place. And it does take quite a bit of force to turn this, which is good. It's not gonna turn on its own or get bumped off-road. I'm really excited to get these installed on the Jeep, along with this entire lift kit. You also receive some magazines, of course, and Rough Country's lineup of parts is looking absolutely incredible as always. Definitely be sure to check out their website. And we have a ton of instructions to help us through this entire process, including a 28-page installation guide for the lift kit itself. And I do want to mention that this lift kit does come in a couple different variations. You can purchase it without shocks, you can purchase it with Rough Country's more basic N3 shocks, or you can purchase this kit with those sweet Vertex shocks. So it goes over each of the different kit's contents. Let's paste back to mine. All right, here we are. So I got the 78650 kit with the Vertex shocks. And just in case you're curious, here are all of the kit contents. You can go ahead and pause this video if you want to look over that insanely long list. And then of course we have installation instructions and pictures going over each and every step. So overall, just right off the bat here, I'm very impressed by the quality of all of these components. Everything is very well packaged and protected. There's not a scratch on anything, and I like how they organized everything in individual boxes just to help organize this chaos that we have in front of us here. So I've got the Jeep in the garage here. She's ready to go up on the lift. However, I had an idea and I hopped online, and I think that these control arms would look really good on the Jeep if they were painted red. So I'm gonna run out and get some paint. Ideally, I would love to powder coat them, but I don't really have the time or money to do so right now. So I'm gonna run out and try to find the most durable paint I can. I'm gonna string these up, paint them, and then we can get working on the Jeep. All right, sorry I didn't update you sooner. My camera battery is charging, but as you can see, I have all of the control arms and the forged track bar strung up here from the garage door. I primed and painted it using Rust-Oleum primer as well as Rust-Oleum high performance enamel. I did 2 coats of primer and 3 coats of enamel, and it's looking really good. As you can see, we have that nice bright red color. Should be very fitting for a rough country video. But yeah, I'm really excited to get working on this tomorrow. It's about 10 o'clock right now, so I'm gonna pack it in, but I'll see you guys in the morning. All right guys, we're back here. It's the following morning. I am getting started a little bit later than I would have liked to because I had to go re-edit a video that I already had uploaded ready for today because it is Friday, and I got a copyright infringement notice, so I had to re-edit that video with new music. It was kind of a pain, but we're out here ready to work on the Jeep. And I actually walked out this morning to find that one of my control arms had just snapped off of this string here and fall into the concrete. There are a few tiny chips, and I want this to be perfect, so I just slapped a new coat on this control arm here. It should be dry very soon, but the rest of the parts are all dry and they came out wonderful. I'm really happy with the finish as well as the color. So I'm gonna cut all these down off the strings, get them back on the moving blanket here, get all of our parts organized and ready. We'll bring the Jeep in, put it up on the lift, and get working. All right, got everything cut down. Looking a lot better if you ask me. I also had a really nice surprise. Tim Cirillo just stopped by. Forgot to get some footage of his Jeep. I'll have to get some later on this weekend, but he drives a lifted TJ. It's lifted about 5 inches, I believe, in a really cool limited edition green. And he dropped off for me a plasma cutter. So I was planning on doing this job with a Sawzall and an angle grinder, and I still will be using those tools, but this plasma cutter is gonna make my life a lot easier in terms of cutting off the factory control arm mounts. That being said, you do not need a plasma cutter to do this job. It can be completed with a basic angle grinder and or a Sawzall. So without any further ado, let's get the Jeep in here, up on the lift, and let's get working. So the first step is to jack up your Jeep and remove the wheels and tires. We then have to unbolt and remove the sway bar, and we are going to be needing a floor jack to get this job done. This old Speedy Lift little floor jack here just isn't cutting it, and I think it's time to treat myself to a nice new jack. So I'm not exactly on a Snap-on budget, but I'm going to run to Harbor Freight, get myself a nice jack. I'm also gonna pick up the necessary hole saw and drill bits for this job as well. So that's gonna be a 1 1/4 inch hole saw, and here are all the tools you need for this job. You can go ahead and pause the video if you wanna take note of that. So I'm gonna go pick up that hole saw as well as those drill bits, and I'm also gonna get myself a face shield and probably something to cover my arms, because working under here, cutting off those factory control arm mounts is gonna be pretty nasty. So you do wanna make sure you're staying safe. See you guys when I get back from Harbor Freight. All right, got my new jack here. I got the Daytona 3-ton heavy duty low profile long reach jack. This is one of their most low profile jacks, and it has the highest maximum lifting height of about 24 inches. And I'm fairly certain this is actually a Snap-on duplicate or replica, so I'm really excited to use this. Treated myself to that. Also treated myself to a new creeper and some new tools. I got myself a face mask for when we're under the car using the grinders and whatnot. Got a hole saw set, new drill bit set, 9/16 bit, 17/32 bit, 2 new ratchets, and some discs for our angle grinder. So I should be all set at this point. Let's get wrenching on the Jeep. Sorry for all the delays. Now let's get wrenching. So the first step here is to support the axle using a floor jack. So I'm just gonna jack it up right under the front diff here. We'll now need an 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench. We'll be disconnecting the sway bar. Man, I really need to get control of this rust. I'm gonna have to wire brush this stuff down and give it a paint job. But anyways, we're gonna be removing this 18mm bolt right here on the bottom end of the sway bar link here. Now using our 18mm socket once again and a 19mm wrench, we're gonna remove the top sway bar link bolt. Just insert our wrench right here and remove the nut on the back. We'll now need to remove the factory skid plate by removing 4 18mm bolts located here, here, and 2 up front. After removing the skid plate, we need to remove the front shock. However, I do need to remove my EAG inner fender here to gain access to that top bolt. So now with my inner fender out of the way, we're free to remove the front shock. To do so, we'll use an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. We'll now need to use a 14mm wrench to remove the top nut located right here. Now that we have our stock shocks out of the way, we can remove our stock springs. However, on some models, such as mine, you'll need to remove this little brake line bracket right here using a 10mm socket. For additional precaution, I'll be removing this brake line bracket right here mounted to the axle, also using a 10mm socket. Now with the brake line brackets removed, I can lower the jack and remove our springs. With our coils out of the way, it's now time to remove our upper control arms, also using an 18mm. As you can see, I've already soaked my fasteners in PB Blaster. This bolt shouldn't be an issue, but they did mention in the instructions that this bolt here, give you another angle from underneath, this bolt here tends to get seized and you may need to cut it with a Sawzall, but I'm gonna get working on these 2 bolts and I'll keep you updated on what happens with this one. Okay, so this front bolt here, very straightforward, very easy to remove. However, this one, the instructions, Rough Country was right. There's something bizarre going on, to be honest. I got the correct size socket on there, I got my box wrench on the back, and it was just spinning. It doesn't seem to be making any progress. However, oh my gosh, I get it now. That's a flag nut. So I had my impact in here trying to turn this. Obviously that flag nut's not going to turn because it's welded to a piece of metal. So I'm gonna use my impact on the other side and I'll see if I can break it loose. If I can't, then we'll take the reciprocating saw to it. Alright, so that actually came out surprisingly easily. I didn't even have to hold this side because, again, it was a flag nut. If you don't know what that is, this here is a flag nut, and essentially it's just a nut welded onto a piece of metal, and that allows you to more easily insert it and hold it in place. So I didn't have to cut that bolt. Came out really easily. We have the upper front control arm out. Now I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side. Now that we have the upper control arms removed, we can now remove the lower control arms using a 21mm socket for both these 2 bolts here. Alright, so the following day here we have all the front suspension removed from the vehicle, and the next step will be to disconnect the front drive shaft. However, before we do so, I do want to put 2 jack stands under the front axle here, because the only things it's connected to at the moment are the drive shaft and the track bar, and I don't like how it's teetering on the jack here, so I'm just going to put 2 jack stands under each side and lower the jack down, give the jack a break, and just make sure this is nice and solid. Now to remove the front drive shaft here, we're going to use a 15mm socket for these 4 front bolts, and then coming to the other end of the drive shaft where it connects to the transfer case here, we'll need to remove a bunch of 8mm screws with an 8mm socket, and I do suggest putting your vehicle in 4 low and first gear to keep this from turning while you're trying to remove these fasteners here. So I removed all 4 of these 15mm bolts here, as well as all of these 8mm up at the transfer case. But I wasn't terribly lucky with disconnecting my drive shaft from the transfer case here. It seems to be fused and I'll need some sort of puller, and I will need to do that in the future because I am installing bigger, beefier drive shafts. But just for the time being here, I have the drive shaft tied up out of the way so that we can access the exhaust, because the next step here is going to be cutting and removing this exhaust loop right here. We're going to need to measure down 2.5 inches from the catalytic converter, make a mark, and cut the exhaust there. And then you're supposed to unbolt the exhaust here, but from the looks of it, I'll be cutting mine. Alright, well, now that we have the exhaust cut, we get to start cutting control arm mounts, which is definitely a little bit sketchy. It may seem overwhelming. I was definitely overwhelmed by the thought of doing so, but now that I'm here doing the install, I can tell it's going to be okay. So for the front control arm mounts here, we're going to cut off this outer dome shaped piece here by going along the side here, up and around the outside. Basically, you want to follow the line where this mount tapers off and connects to the frame, but you do want to be careful not to cut the frame itself and not to cut through into this inner part of the control arm mount, because once we cut this outer part off, we'll be cutting out a smaller section of this inner part here. So I'm going to do as much of this as I can with the plasma cutter. I'll probably get up to about here, and then I'll have to use the grinder to go the remainder of the way around. I'm going to get started on this and I'll keep you guys updated. So now that I've cut off this outer piece here, we do have to cut off the inner piece, and same as before, we're just going to follow the natural lines here. So we're going to cut right along here, along the outside where the tapered part meets the flat part of the frame. So now you can better see why I said you have to be careful on this outside cut, because if you go too far in, you're going to cut through metal that we don't want to cut through. So if you are using a plasma cutter as I did, come in parallel to the frame and make sure you don't cut through. But anyways, I'm gonna make this cut here, and then we'll move on to the upper control arm mounts. It's pretty basic. We're just gonna follow the line all the way around the outside and chop off the whole mount all at once. Alrighty, so we're done making all of our cuts here. As you can see, I have both the lower and the upper control arm mounts cut off from the frame, and it honestly wasn't too bad at all. I was able to do it all with the plasma cutter, and I am very fortunate and lucky to have access to a plasma cutter. However, that being said, you can absolutely do this with a grinder and a cutting disc and or a reciprocating saw. So at this point, I'm now gonna have to go back with my grinder and a grinding wheel just to clean all of this up. I wanna get it as flush to the frame as possible, and then we'll hit it with a coat of paint to prevent any corrosion from forming. Alright, all done grinding both sides down here. My arms and shoulders are extremely tired. I had my arms up holding that grinder there for at least an hour, and I'm not even exaggerating. I've been grinding this for at least an hour. It took quite a long time to grind down these two sections here to get it flush with the frame. Same thing on the other side, but we're done, and we can now hit it with some Rust-Oleum. And as another step of preventative maintenance, I am going to take a wire brush to the axle here. Some of this is dirt, but there is a significant amount of surface rust here. So I'm going to take a wire brush to it, and I'll also hit that with some Rust-Oleum as well. Because if we're doing all this work to the Jeep, we want it to last, right? So I'll check in with you after I've applied my Rust-Oleum. Also, side note, we were supposed to remove the exhaust Y pipe earlier, and I kind of just pushed it out of the way because this clamp that was holding on the Y pipe here was extremely corroded. A along with the bolt securing it, and I had to cut it. As you can see, I had to bend these out a little bit with a flathead because this was also corroded and seized together, but I managed to break it loose by pulling down on this. It kind of rotates the pipe. As you can see, it's still pretty stuck, but we do need to remove this. We made our 2.5-inch cut down from the catalytic converter there, and the one other cut we're gonna have to make for us 2012 to 2018 owners, we're gonna have to cut off 1.5 inches from the end of this pipe here, and we'll also have to grind off this little alignment tab right here. That's essentially just gonna allow the entire Y pipe to shift back a bit. It's gonna be very close to the cross member here, and it's gonna give us the clearance that we need. All right, inside of the frame is painted, along with the outside here and most of the axle. Got as much as I can. Just wanted to protect the frame, protect it from rust. I'll probably have to hit it with another coat later, but we're gonna keep working right now. Next step is to put a jack under the cross member here to support it while we remove some bolts from it. Jeez. We got a surprise visitor from Texas here. Now that the cross member is supported, we're gonna need an 18mm to remove these two bolts right here. All right guys, so update here. I'm encountering a bit of a frustrating issue here. This is the point at which we install, let me get it oriented properly. This is the point at which we install this rough country control arm bracket, which bolts onto the frame here and into the cross member. Now, I just lined it up, and here, let me pull these bolts out. These are the bolts you're supposed to bolt it in with. Line it up here with those two holes on the cross member, and this hole does not line up because of the remaining material right here on the frame rail. Rough Country instructed us to cut this and grind it down so that it's smooth. That's what I did. They should have been more specific in their instructions, because this portion right here, it appears that it needs to be removed entirely and it needs to be flush with the frame in order for this bracket to fit properly. So pretty frustrating that I just painted this and went to install the bracket and it doesn't fit. So I'm gonna have to come back with my cutting disc, and I'll probably just cut right here, and I'll try to cut this weld. It's gonna be pretty difficult. I'll probably have to do bit more grinding. Not looking forward to it, but it's necessary, so see you when I'm done. All right, so I got both sides trimmed down the remainder of the way, and I'm verified that the bracket does in fact fit. I just hit it with some more paint, and while we're letting this dry, I'm gonna work on the exhaust Y pipe over there. So on the Y pipe here, we just have to trim off 1.5 inches from the end here, and we also have to grind off this little alignment tab here. I'll use my reciprocating saw to cut off the end, and then just an angle grinder and a grinding disc to grind this off. All right, so I completed the exhaust here, ground off that alignment tab and cleaned up the edges, so it should go in pretty seamlessly. And I was just checking out our next step here of attaching the new control arm bracket to the frame, and it essentially bolts in with those two bolts there, and then one bolt in the bottom of the frame rail here. There are two short bolts supplied in the bag specified for this step, and we have a coarse bolt. This one does not fit whatsoever, and the fine 12mm by 1.25 pitch begins to thread into this frame rail nut right here, but as soon as it begins to thread in, it locks up, and I really don't want to force it and mess up my threads. So I'm going to run down to Napa, and I'm going to grab a 12 by 1.25 tap, and I'm going to rethread that nut. There could be some rust or debris in that nut just because it's been exposed to the elements. So I'll be back with that tap, we'll tap it out, and it should work out just fine. All right, so I tapped out this hole using a 12mm by 1.25 pitch tap. I used some old motor oil for lubricant, and this bolt finally threads into place here. So we can now proceed with installing the front control arm brackets. So we finally have our first bracket mounted up on the frame here. It's not completely mounted yet. The 3 bolts securing it right now are this 12 by 35mm bolt, which bolts into the frame rail here. As you can see, I did have to slightly enlarge the hole on this bracket here because it really wasn't lining up properly. Now, I don't really recommend doing so. So if your bracket does line up, don't drill it, don't worry about it. Maybe a slight strength compromise, but not the end of the world. And anyways, the other two bolts are right here. They both go through the frame rail and are secured by these two nuts and washers on the back. All three of these fasteners are 19 millimeter. You can torque them down to 55 foot-pounds. Now here's the thing, Rough Country instructs us now to mark these holes and remove the bracket to drill the holes. Now I've done a lot of this type of work in the past, not necessarily installing a lift kit, but marking holes and then drilling and then putting the bracket back on doesn't always work out perfectly because your drill is likely to be off from the exact point that it needs to drill. So I'm going to leave my bracket on here and I'll use this bracket as a template for drilling. We'll need to use a 17/32 inch drill bit to drill out these holes here, to drill out these 4 holes here on the inside of the frame rail. Do not drill through the outside of the frame rail. A little update here on the drilling. I have all 3 of these lower holes drilled. Unfortunately, long story short, we're not going to be able to drill that top hole today. I don't think I'm going to be able to drill it at all because, as you can see, the cat and the exhaust come down here, and in order to drill this, I'd have to drill at about a 30-degree angle here, and that's just no good. I'm not really sure what to do. I did call Rough Country and I asked them, what do you do in this situation with the exhaust in the way? I was told to remove these 2 nuts right here, and apparently the exhaust would swing out of the way, but it's bolted to the engine. So I really didn't want to take this off. I didn't want to unbolt the exhaust from the engine, but I said fine, I'll do it. And I ended up snapping off the head of that bolt. So I stopped it there. I said, that's it. I'm not damaging the Jeep here to get that one hole drilled. It'll be just fine with 6 bolts instead of 7. So to bolt up the bracket, we'll need to grab these 3 flag nuts right here. We'll also need a handful of these 1/2 inch by 1.5 bolts, flat washer, and a lock washer. You'll want to grab yourself some small vice grips, or needle nose vice grips would be even better. And you're going to insert the flag nut right through the frame here and line it up with the hole like so. Hard for me to show you with one hand, but we'll then take the bolt, insert it, and tighten it down. We'll do the same thing for this hole here, and we'll be coming in from the outside for this flag nut here. So these 2 bolted in, we'll move to the outside. We'll grab our larger flag nut, and same process here, except we'll be inserting this flag nut from the outside. It'll be a little bit more tricky to hold this and maneuver it from the inside, but you get the point. Now that we have both the passenger side and the driver side control arm brackets installed on the vehicle, we can now finally begin to install these sweet new long arms. We'll begin with an upper front control arm. Take one of these smaller flex joints, thread it into this small upper control arm, and we want to measure this out to a length of 27 3/4 of an inch from center to center, meaning from the center of this hole here to the center of this hole here. Now that these flex joints are installed in the upper arms, we're going to install 2 of these larger flex joints in the lower arms here to a length of 33.5 center to center. We're now going to take these upper control arms and we'll install them on the vehicle in this upper bracket here, the flex end of the joint that is, using these 12 by 85 mil bolts. A quick note to make sure that your grease fittings on these upper arms are facing inwards and downwards so that they're accessible when installed on the vehicle. Once you have them bolted onto the brackets here, we're going to use the factory hardware to secure the front of the control arm back onto the axle here. Now that we have the upper arms installed, it's time to install the lower arms here. And I do want to note that the grease fitting should be facing upwards. We're going to install those lower arms using the supplied 14 by 100 millimeter bolts here and these lock nuts. All right, we got all 4 front control arms installed. They're looking sweet, as you can see here. By the way, you want to leave them all finger tight at this point. Do not yet tighten them. And now at this point, if you've yet to do so, you need to modify your exhaust. So if you don't remember, chop off 1.5 inches from the end and grind off that alignment tab. That exhaust loop that we cut out much earlier on is going to be replaced by this long exhaust pipe here. This is going to clamp on to the section that we cut off. And on this end here, we're going to bolt it up with the flange, just as it was originally. Now on the passenger side, we're also going to have to extend the exhaust, but that's much simpler. We're just going to install this 1.5 inch spacer and the extended hardware. So I'm going to get the Y pipe back in there, back under the car. We're going to bolt up these extensions and get that back end clamped back on to the rest of the exhaust. Just at dinner, I'm going to keep working until my parents go to bed. Then I gotta shut it down. Little update here on the exhaust. I got the exhaust long tube clamped on there with that exhaust clamp. I have my flange at this end lined up. I have my spacer kind of in place here, and you'll notice I don't have hardware on either of my flanges because if you recall, I cut both flanges because the hardware was extremely corroded, as it usually is on exhaust systems. I'm honestly kind of surprised Rough Country didn't give us new hardware. That's not a big deal. I can just run to the hardware store and get some generic bolts, bolt up those flanges, and we'll be all good with the exhaust. I also did have to replace this clamp here, but that was like 12 bucks at Napa, not a big deal. So at this point, we can finally get going on installing the sweet new Vertex shocks. I cannot wait to install these puppies. They look sweet. So to install these Vertex shocks, we're gonna be installing these front shock relocation brackets. They go right in here like so, and it essentially just shifts the shock outwards a bit and corrects the geometry. So for the installation of this shock relocation bracket, we're gonna use this big 5/8 bolt and a flat washer, stick it through the back hole, slip that through the top of the shock mount, and then we'll slide this thick black washer over the top of that bolt and use the provided nut to lock that in place. Now to secure the back part of the bracket here, we'll be using this 1/2-inch bolt, 2 flat washers, and a lock nut. We'll be using a 19 mil for this bolt here, and then for the top bolt, you can either use a 15/16 socket or 24 millimeter if you don't have a 15/16. Now that we have the shock relocation brackets installed, we can finally install these puppies in the front of the car here using the provided hardware. We're first gonna put one of the cup washers onto the shock, then this rubber shock absorber, which has this nipple shape on the top. Then slide it through shock tower, install the circular rubber shock absorber on top, and finally one more cup washer. And last but not least, the lock nut. We'll use a traditional 17 millimeter box wrench to tighten down this top bolt, and then we'll take care of mounting the bottom. Man, this is already looking sweet. So once we have the top bolted in here and tightened down, we can come down to the bottom, take these 2 aluminum spacers here and press them into the bottom of the shock. It may take a little bit of force. I was able to do it by hand here, and that essentially just corrects the spacing of the bottom of the shock for our mount here. So I'm gonna bring it into place. I'm gonna jack up the axle, slide the stock hardware through, and we'll tighten it down. Slap your Vertex sticker on there and you're all set. Except I did forget to put on my spring, so I'm gonna have to unbolt the bottom, lower the axle, and get my spring in there, raise it back up, and put that bottom bolt back in. And a quick note, if you are having trouble lining up your axle here, and this goes for anything at all, you may have to unbolt your track bar in order to get your axle positioned properly for your lower shock mount or for any of your control arms. The instructions didn't specify that, but I found it necessary and it immediately resolved my issue. So I'm gonna get my spring on here and I'm gonna go tackle the other side. I haven't done the driver's side yet, but can we just appreciate, oh my gosh. Talk about travel. These things are just absolutely insane. Absolutely crazy. I am so hyped to have these shocks on the Jeep here. I can't wait to go test them out. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but man, this is gonna be well worth it. 11 o'clock now, still grinding. Got the driver's side and the passenger side done. The instructions do state that we're not gonna do the new front track bar until after we're done with the rear suspension. But right now, I do wanna tackle removing these old brake lines because they are too short. And we're gonna install these sweet new stainless steel extended brake lines specifically for this vehicle. So that's pretty straightforward. We're just gonna unbolt the brake line right here and then unbolt it from the caliper here. If you've just painted your control arms like I did, or even if you haven't, you want to take the extra precaution, I suggest you cut up a trash bag and cover them up because brake fluid is highly corrosive and it will ruin your paint. So definitely be careful working with the brake fluid. Know that some is gonna leak and just try to switch out the line as quick as possible and you won't have brake fluid everywhere. All right, just finished up the brake lines, passenger and driver's side here. And here are a few tips I wish I knew. Unfortunately, and strangely enough, there are no instructions on the front brake lines, just the rears. You're gonna need a 15mm to break this bolt loose from the caliper. They include 2 new crush washers, which you need to install outside and inside of that brake line end. This brake line hose right here is a 12mm, and you'll also need a 17mm to hold this brake line still while you're tightening that 12. Now, before you connect your new brake line, you do need to take note of the fact that there is a right and a left brake line. The right one tapers in towards the center of the car, left one tapers in towards the center of the car. You'll notice that in person. Second important note, you need to install this little L bracket before installing the brake line. That little bracket then uses the same factory mounting location and factory 10mm bolt. Bolts right in there, and then you use the spring clip to lock the brake line in place here. I went ahead and I zip tied my brake pad wear wire right up to the brake line here. And I do want to note that Rough Country thought of the fact that this sometimes may make contact, and they put a little rubber guard over the line. So nice job, Rough Country, thinking of that detail. Brake lines are in, they're looking good. And as you can see, they still have a little slack in line even at full extension here. I was just checking out the next step and I looked at the time and it's already past midnight. So it's time to wrap it up for tonight. I'll see you guys in the morning. All right, it's the following morning here. Sorry if I sound kind of dead right now. All this work is really starting to catch up with me. I was up really late last night and got up pretty early this morning. I'm really sore, really tired, but we're gonna keep on pushing on this. I'm gonna run to the hardware store and get that replacement hardware for the exhaust flanges. We'll get that all buttoned up, and then we'll be putting on the wheels and tires, lowering this down, and installing the new sway bar links and quick disconnects. All right, so the exhaust is all done. I went and got some nice stainless hardware for both this side, and you can see this 1.5-inch spacer inserted here. And then we also have this long extension pipe here that gets rid of that factory loop and gives us more clearance. That's also bolted up with some stainless hardware, as you can see. So the exhaust wide pipe is back in. As you can see, what that does is it shifts the exhaust all the way up against this cross member. Well, almost up against it, and it gives us more clearance, specifically more clearance for the drive shaft here. So we can now reinstall the wheels and tires, lower this to the ground, and we'll install the new sway bar links and quick disconnects. All right, all 4 wheels and tires back on. I'm about to lower it down on the ground, but guys, just look at this. Look at the comparison in travel from front to rear. It's crazy. I can't even believe I was off-roading on stock suspension doing the gnarly off-roading that I was. This is just absolutely insane. The front of the car looks like a monster truck right now. I love that I painted the arms red. Matches up great with the decals on the shocks there, and I can't wait to tackle the rear. So let's lower this down on the ground and see what it looks like. Definitely looks a little funny right now, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah, let's get going on those sway bar disconnects. So the first step here is to install the supplied jam nut onto the link here. And they did specify to measure out 11 inches from end to end, but that's not even possible with this particular set. They must have reused the instructions from an old set. So I measured mine out to 11.5 inches end to end. And then you just take the jam nut and tighten it up against the end. We'll now install the upper end on the sway bar here. And I'm gonna use a 15mm wrench and a 15mm socket to tighten this down. All right, I just realized what they meant by measure 11 inches from end to end on the sway bar. So this just wasn't making any sense because my sway bar was down. So I'm gonna pull this up a bit. I'm gonna pull this off. And we need to measure out 11 inches from this end to this end here, not actually on the link itself. As you can see, this length still doesn't really match up that well, so grab your bracket. They are directional to each side, so you're just going to grab your right bracket here, slide it on through the link, and we can now adjust the sway bar accordingly. You're going to want this bracket in between this circle here and this body mount bracket here, and you're going to want the top of the bracket to be pretty much flush with the top of the frame. So just adjust the sway bar and make sure that the link can in fact come off of the bracket, like so. If it's too far forward, it's gonna run into this body mount bracket and you won't be able to remove it. So we're gonna get our bracket into a comfortable location here where it can in fact come off the bracket easily without hitting this bracket here. So I like that location right there. So we're going to pull off the link and we're going to mark these 2 holes. We'll now need to drill out these 2 holes here with a 17/64 drill bit. With these 2 holes now drilled, we can use the 2 provided self-tapping bolts and a 1/2-inch wrench to secure this bracket to the frame. Now that we have our bracket installed and our arm does in fact fit on it, we can now install the new supplied mounting pin down here on the axle. We're going to be using the supplied flat washer and lock nut to do so. We'll tighten this down using a 19mm. And to hold the other side of the pin still, since we can't hold it still with a wrench, you can just stick a screwdriver through this pinhole here to hold it still while we're tightening that 19mm. And here's what she should look like when it's all done. Securing the bottom is very simple. We just slide this link right onto that pin, and then we use this large flat washer and this quick disconnect pin right here, which you can pull out very easily, and that secures the bottom of the link. Now I did wait until I had this on here to tighten down this jam nut here. This is a 19mm, and you can use an 18mm to hold this end still. I'm now going to disconnect this and put this up on that bracket before going to install the bracket on the driver's side, because we want both brackets to line up together. Alright, I was about to jump into the rear and I just remembered we forgot to torque down the control arm. So we're going to lower the Jeep down onto the ground so that all the weight is on the front end, and we're going to torque those down. So we're instructed to torque down the bracket end of the control arms to the factory specs, which is 75 foot-pounds. We then need to torque down the axle side of the upper at 75 foot-pounds as well, and the lower control arms on the axle side need to be torqued down to 120 foot-pounds. The upper control arm uses an 18mm wrench, and the bottom uses a 21mm. Once we have all of our control arms torqued down, we can then use a grease gun and grease all the fittings. You also need a large adjustable wrench such as this one to torque down the jam nuts on the control arms to lock our length settings into place. Alright folks, that wraps up the installation of all of the front components for the JK long arm kit from Rough Country. This has definitely been a long haul and we still have a lot of work to do in the rear. I am splitting the video up into 2 parts here. Part 2 of the rear suspension should be coming out next week, if not the following week. This thing is going to be an absolute beast with all of these components, and I hope you guys are excited as I am to see it when it's all done. I'd like to pay a huge thank you to Rough Country for making this video possible. Rough Country is actually the only company that I know of that offers a 4-inch long arm bolt-on kit that doesn't require any welding, which is one of the many reasons I chose to go with Rough Country. I actually had to call Rough Country 2 times during this installation just because I had a couple questions, and when you call their customer support number, you actually get a real human right off the bat. No robots, no nothing, just real enthusiasts like you and me who are looking to help you out. So I'm really glad I went with Rough Country for this kit, and I highly suggest you check out their products linked in the description below. Please go smash that like button, leave any questions, comments, or otherwise in the comments below. Subscribe for more Jeep content, and I'll see you guys next time on JD Cars.